Hello again, I'm Braddock Supervisor John Cook. Welcome back to Braddock Neighborhood News, the program I am using to provide you with information on issues facing our community and ideas on how we can strengthen our neighborhoods. This month, I'm pleased to have with us Sandy Bromley, who serves as the Fairfax County-wide Domestic Violence Coordinator, and Kim Corle, Board Chair for NOVACO, a nonprofit organization that provides affordable housing for victims of domestic violence. With October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I thought it would be timely to discuss this serious but sometimes hidden issue. Sandy, Kim, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Sandy, talk a little bit about what the Domestic Violence Council is and why we've got a whole lot of different groups working on this issue, and you have the easy job of pulling them all together, including those 7:30 in the morning meetings that we go to.
That's right, which we love having you at, Supervisor Cook. Absolutely. So our Domestic Violence Prevention Policy and Coordinating Council convenes, like you said, about 4 times a year, and we get about 40 plus agencies and community nonprofits together to talk about any issue related to domestic violence, whether it's investigation and prosecution, or prevention, or community outreach and awareness.
And just some of the examples of folks, we have folks from faith community on the county agencies, everything from health to human services, older adults, women, children.
Absolutely. We've got groups that are representing offender services, so they run the batterer intervention programs, the police department, our prosecutors, from those folks to folks who work with elders, people with disabilities, people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. So really a wide variety of people that are all represented.
It's a very complex, multifaceted issue, and Kim, one part of that issue that your agency does a lot of work with is housing. Very critical. When somebody's in a domestic violence situation, they need to leave where they are, and they need to go someplace.
That's right.
And that's where you step in.
Yeah, we are a 13-year-old nonprofit, and we're similar to the work that she does in that we bridge the community with the clients. We rely a lot on sponsor support. The faith community comes in and helps us quite a bit. But what we do is we get clients out of the shelter and into transitional housing, and we have them there for about 2 to 3 years. While we do that, we're trying to teach them self-sustainability so they learn how to get a job, learn how to drive, financial management, daycare. I mean, it's a heavy lifting job of trying to get them up and going, but it works really well. It's a great model, and our success rate is pretty high.
And when we talk about domestic violence, that term, there's a lot in that term.
Yes.
It's not just somebody who physically takes, a beating to somebody else, although that happens, but in fact, the number one type of murder in this county is domestic violence. It was a shocking resource or statistic when I learned that, but it involves a whole lot of other stuff, Sandy.
It does, absolutely. So you're right, almost half of our homicides every year are related to domestic violence, and they don't always start out with physical abuse and immediately jump to homicide. It really starts out with some emotional abuse. We see a lot of financial control and abuse, so not allowing your partner to open a bank account or to have their own credit cards. We also see some spiritual abuse, so not allowing them to practice their religion of choice or using religion against them in some ways, ahead of household beliefs, those kinds of things. And so we see a wide variety of tactics that offenders are using against victims, essentially to keep them in control.
And running the whole gamut from people in marriages, maybe long-term marriages, to people who are together not in marriage, to people who have not been together a long time. And so it's not just sort of any standard type of situation. There's all sorts of combinations out there, including combinations with children involved, and that's the hardest.
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot more teen dating violence, so violence between young folks who are just starting to learn how to develop relationships and start dating. And then a majority of our victims report that their kids are witnessing the violence, and we see that nationally. About 1 in 4 kids are witnessing domestic violence between their parents.
And something I learned in our last meeting, the video you showed us about the children in the home where violence is occurring, even if the children aren't involved in the violence, they might not even be in the room, but they know it's happening, and the effect on them may be even more critically damaging than on the person who's physically getting the abuse. And that was really a telling statistic and something we really need to focus on.
Absolutely. There are many behavioral and developmental effects of violence on kids that we're seeing play out as bullying, future teen dating violence, but also things like acting out in teenage pregnancy, gang involvement. So there's a lot of connections there between them witnessing violence at a young age.
Right. No, I was just going to reiterate that and say that it's an interesting topic because there's an immediate impact and a long-term impact. And I think that that's why our transitional model works well, because we're there for 2 to 3 years helping them overcome the effects of abuse. But the children have incredible statistics. If they don't get help and get some counseling going through the trauma, that they're much more likely to have issues long-term down the road, which of course impacts society. It's a hard issue because it also cuts across everything, demographically, financially. I mean, there is no typical prototype, which is very difficult.
And the role of housing, which we've kind of come to learn is really the critical step, that until somebody's in safe housing, that's permanent, and we see this in our homeless issues, domestic violence. We got to get the housing piece there first, because without that foundation, the other services, the counseling, it's just not going to be effective.
Right. Well, they're much more likely to go back to the offender because there's nowhere else to go. So it's not just the safe housing piece, but having, I think, the support piece as well. I mean, we're really lucky. We've got some faith communities that come in and house the housing. I mean, they bring in all of the furniture and decorations and donate things, everything to cleaning supplies. So when they walk in that house, their real issue is overcoming trauma and taking care of themselves instead of also managing the house. So it helps quite a bit.
What, we talked a little bit about the themes, Sandy. You mentioned some of the underlying themes of the types of domestic violence that we see, and how do people who want to help learn about this? Because we know a lot of victims keep this to themselves, and of course we want to encourage them not to do that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But what are the signs that people ought to be looking for? You know, if you see somebody who's a friend or in the workplace or in your church or in your school that's exhibiting certain behaviors, what should trigger a thought of, hey, I wonder if something's happening?
Sure. A lot of times what we see is that victims are isolated. So if at one point you had a lot of contact with the victim and then that they sort of drift off, and then you're a little bit concerned about maybe some of the controlling behaviors that they're under at home, you know, maybe try to figure out a way to pull them aside and say, hey, I'm concerned for your safety. How can I help? I think a lot of people are really just scared to do that very simple intervention because they think it's a family problem. It's something that they don't want to intervene in. But bystander intervention is actually one of the most crucial and really important parts of prevention and getting services to these folks so that the cycle doesn't continue.
And to realize that it's not just sort of the stereotypical, if you see someone with a black eye, ask how they got it.
Right.
There's a whole, what other things should people be looking for, be aware of, that signs that victims will give?
Sure. So like I said, the isolation pulling away, but also like at the workplace, if you're seeing one of your coworkers get repeated phone calls from the offender, feel like they have to rush home because they might make their partner mad if they're not home right on time, feel like they constantly have to check their text messages or they can't text anybody of the opposite gender. Those are all sort of clues that there's a lot of controlling behaviors happening at home, which may be a sign of a domestic violence relationship.
Okay. And so the message to folks is, if they're seeing that, just, you know, be a friend and use some common sense, and don't be afraid to suggest to somebody, if you think, hey, if something's happening, get some help, or just to inquire, say, is everything okay?
Exactly.
It's okay to ask people that people appreciate, you know, that somebody cares.
Exactly.
I think there's another piece to that too, which is helping people understand there's a cycle. And so what happens is there might be an incident, and then afterwards there's a honeymoon period. And after that, they might say, oh, everything's okay, but then you start noticing the trend again. And I think if they feel that there's a safe place and somebody that they can talk to in confidence, because it's very scary to people, and a lot of them are shamed and humiliated by the whole idea that they're in this environment and this is happening to them. So, you know, you might say one day, are you okay? And they act a little odd, and 2 days later, oh, everything's great. But the cycle will continue. It doesn't stop. And I think that's an important piece of it.
There are cultural issues too. You know, we have people from all over the world who live here in the county. It's one of our strengths as a county. But you know, we have certain cultural standards where we don't tolerate domestic violence. Those standards aren't necessarily the same in other places, and people come here, and some behavior that happens here, maybe somebody brought that idea with them from someplace else. But how does that get involved here?
Sure. Well, culture, immigration status is definitely a barrier for a lot of victims to report the crime to law enforcement. They may feel afraid that something's going to happen when they do report, and in fact, they won't. Law enforcement wants you to report any crime. And another barrier is just sort of feeling ashamed. Sometimes in different cultures, family means different things than, you know, and they don't want their family drama to be aired, so to speak. And so that's another piece that sort of just prevents a lot of victims from reaching out and getting help that come from different backgrounds.
Right, and to know that it might be tolerated, accepted in some places, and it's not here.
Right.
And so we want to say, one, to those who are committing, you know, violence, that's not tolerated. We don't tolerate that here. And to the victims, we want to say, come forward, let us help you.
Exactly.
And it makes it complicated.
Yes,
Not
it does.
easy. And that's why we have so many people on the council who are trying to pull so many different areas, from healthcare to law enforcement, courts, and everything else together. And Kim, I know you see that with the clients that you serve.
Yes.
You know, I'm sure you can't give us the prototype person, because there are all sorts of people.
There is, and there is no typical, and that's what is a challenge, and why the work is so important. And we have people from all over the world, as well as from, you know, our country, and there's a common theme, and that is the humiliation and the shame and the embarrassment. But I think once they get away from the controller and they start gaining some self-esteem and realizing, no matter what culture they came from, but when they get here and they start healing and realizing that this isn't tolerated and they can stand on their own and they are going to be okay. It's kind of reprogramming some of the internal messages. And once they get through that, it really does change them. But it definitely brings in some new challenges. There's everything from immigration status, driving, and I think that the role of women in different societies versus what we have here is another thing that we've taken on. I mean, we've have some women who are, you know, I'm not allowed to work, and we're like, yes, you are allowed to work. Right. So, and you should be working to help, and they do, and they love it. And it's nice to watch them thrive, but there is no cookie cutter. There is no cookie cutter.
And part of what we're maybe focusing on more, I don't want to say see more, because I think it's always been there, but we talked about dating, teen violence, young adults. Not everybody that comes into NOVACO is somebody who's, you know, 35 and my husband hit me.
Right, that's exactly right.
It's a whole range of folks.
That's exactly right. And it's interesting, because I think the advent of technology has actually made it a little bit more challenging. There's a lot of passive aggressive and controlling behaviors that go on through text messaging and phone calls and things that, you know, they're devices that we never had before. And we see young girls, I mean under 20, that come through our system, that have children, that have been engaged or with men or married to somebody who has abused them and used different devices that, you know, it wasn't necessarily just, the best way to describe it is people don't walk down the street and hit somebody. It starts off with small pieces of controlling behavior, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and you become at this point where you're scared of the perpetrator, you're scared of pleasing them. And many of them feel like they can love them out of it or manage them out of it if they do a little bit more, but again, the cycle just continues. And so what we're finding with this younger generation is that they don't have as much guidance on this, because I think some of the original messages that we might have grown up with have been watered down a bit. And so it's like, well, he's having a bad day, you know, well, he's got a temper, you know, he's having a rough time. And I think that that's another piece of it. They make excuses for them.
Well, we see that theme with victims and perpetrators, victims who will somehow, it must be my fault.
Right,
you know,
exactly.
That this happened to me, and it's not.
Right.
You know? And that message of support, we were talking before about what can a friend do or a coworker, is to say, you know, it's not your fault.
Yeah, and it's nice for them to hear that.
To
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. And people should be aware of that. Kim, talk a little bit about the challenges that your organization has finding housing. It's not like it's just out there.
It is such a struggle. You know, in addition to finding housing, when they graduate, we put them into, you know, we try to get them co-located somewhere. And the voucher system is tricky right now, as you guys all know. And we work really hard to place them in an environment that continues the safe idea and the safe housing. We're lucky that Shelter House has the Ives House, and so we've got some people there, and I think that that's been a fabulous program. So we've got a couple of families within one environment, and they kind of help each other out, and that model seems to work well. But finding the housing is incredibly difficult. That's why we hold on to it and take great care of our properties, because it's tricky. Some of the different churches rent properties to us, you know, for a small fee, and then we agree to take care of them and put our clients in there, so that works well. Yeah,
and you need to have housing that's affordable. Obviously,
Yes.
your organization's a nonprofit.
Yes.
And so we don't want a whole lot of high-end housing, because that you've got limited funds and you're trying
Sure.
to get a volume of housing, but it's hard to find.
It is hard to find.
Affordable apartments, houses.
You know, we're kind of like a bridge between, we work with HUD and get HUD funding to get some of the housing. We get grants, obviously. The faith community comes in, but we really are a network of support in terms of different community organizations. Another challenge that we have is that the sponsors that come in, you know, some of the levels of giving are disparate. So we might have one group come in and they have 2 people that can help, and we have another group come in and they have 40. So we try to fill in the gaps of what's needed. So it's tailored services, I think, are really critical, especially for domestic violence, because it's not a cookie cutter approach. Everybody's coming in with a, you know, different story, different needs, different amounts of children. I mean, I've got somebody right now with 6 children. You know, it's a lot to manage, and that person alone is recovering from trauma in addition to trying to raise her family.
Right. Sandy, the Domestic Violence Action Center, something you're involved in. Tell us how that fits in with this discussion.
Sure. So the Domestic Violence Action Center, which is what we call DVAC, it's a co-located service center. It's designed to be sort of a one-stop shop for victims. It's located right in the historic courthouse, so it's right across from the main courthouse. And victims are able to walk in and sort of just be able to learn what their options are, talk to an advocate, do some crisis counseling, figure out what they can do, whether they want a protective order, whether they want to report to the police or not, really anything. It's just an open and safe space for victims to go to. But the cool thing about DVAC is that it's actually a county agency and a community nonprofit partnership. So it's a public-private partnership. Everyone decided to come together and utilize and sort of pool our resources together in this time of an economic downturn, that a lot of us don't have our own individual resources,
Right.
but together we can work to help victims and also hold offenders accountable. So the other thing that our DVAC project does is provides our Commonwealth Attorney's Office with 2 prosecutors who are specialized in domestic violence. And we also have a protective order compliance monitor, which is sort of like a criminal probation officer, but for civil protective orders. So we do both the victim piece and the offender piece to try to ultimately heal our community from this issue.
Yeah, and we haven't talked too much yet about the courts, but these are crimes, legal issues, and on our council we've got the judges involved, the prosecutors, and a lot of the importance here is coordinating the legal system aspect.
Exactly. Yeah, it can be pretty overwhelming for both victims and offenders to walk through that process. And so it is important to have folks who are trained in domestic violence, who understand the cycle that Kim talked about, understand that some days victims might want to report and might want to move forward with their case, and other days they may show up and not want to. And so understanding that, working with the victims, working with offenders to get them into bad intervention programs, those are all really important pieces of the criminal and civil justice systems that we're able to do when you have folks that are better trained.
When we start to move out and talk about the community sort of around this, we talked about, okay, you can come here to DVAC and NOVACO has services, but domestic violence affects the community as a whole, not just the person who's the victim. And let's talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, it impacts everything from social services and the cost to work and welfare, education systems. We've got a client right now that we have probably 4 counselors working with her children on various issues. It's an impact. It's a huge impact, and it's long term. And I think that that's why, especially for the children, getting them support and intervention before they continue the cycle and lose self-esteem and get into behavioral issues and become an additional drain. We really try to help them get through that. But it has huge cultural and societal impacts long term, I think.
You know, when you think about the strength a lot of people would say they get from their family, it's sort of the foundation of what they do, and you build on that, and then you get your education, you get your job, and your community work, and everything else. Domestic violence rips that foundation out, and as hard as it might be to deal with a job loss or to deal with something in these other areas, you know, what do you say to somebody? Well, you fall back on your family. When the family is where your problem is, everything above it falls down, and so that really becomes so important, right? And what we see happening to people, that everything in their life falls apart.
Absolutely, and you see levels of trauma then. So you have, you know, not only the victims that are being abused and dealing with that trauma, but then their kids who are witnessing it and who are dealing with that trauma. There could be levels of trauma from immigration, so coming over from their home country, and then some of the sort of acting out behaviors that folks might get into, drugs and alcohol to cope. Gang involvement, et cetera. So absolutely, you see a whole lot of repercussions from that foundation being torn apart.
And that foundation, and we touched upon this earlier, you know, a lot of people like to say, well, that's not me, or that's, you know, somebody else or some other group, but we see victims of domestic violence in every economic class, in every racial and ethnic class, every age group, and nobody can say, well, somehow I'm not in the strata of society where this happens, and in fact, that can be a dangerous assumption to sort of think, well, this isn't me, this is somebody else.
Absolutely, and denial is very powerful. I mean, it's very easy to turn away, and we were talking earlier, I mean, I think it's a scary topic for people. I think it scares people, because I've talked to people in the past, and they've said, well, maybe I'm getting abused. And you know, if you're being controlled and you're arranging your behavior around somebody else, it does start that way, and it does start with the fear of keeping somebody happy, and it can escalate into, obviously, I mean, a homicide, but it's a very difficult topic, and I think awareness is so important so that people understand that there's a cycle to it. There's nothing wrong with talking about it and reporting it, and there's a lot of people out there willing to help.
And ideally, talking about it before it reaches the level of a criminal activity.
Yes,
and that's you know, that prevention piece. You know, and you know, not to worry so much about that title. You know, somebody hears domestic violence and they're thinking, oh, a murder or a rape or something very serious. But we want to get to it before it comes to that.
Yes.
And so you don't have to wait and say, well, I haven't been the victim of a crime yet, so this isn't for me. This is about, okay, if things aren't going right in your life, get some help or talk to people, and let's not get into that cycle, because when we get into it, it doesn't go good places.
Yep, exactly.
And we're dealing with a lot of that prevention part on the council. We're trying to figure out how to deal with it.
Exactly, and I think what Kim said, outreach and awareness is so crucial. I know our fatality review team, where we look at domestic violence related homicides, none of those victims had talked to a domestic violence advocate prior to being murdered. And that was really sad for us, because we have advocates available, we have the hotline available. We want to make sure people are reaching out before it gets too serious.
You know, and you mentioned the homicides. I think it was 8 out of 14 last year in Fairfax County were domestic violence related. If you didn't put a label on a crime and you said to people, there's a crime spree, and that's 50% of our homicide rate, people just on that would say, we must stop this immediately. Right? You know, oh, it must be burglars, or it must be whatever. And you say, no, it's people in the home, domestic violence. And if that wake-up call, you know, if that's not out there, we're missing the boat. And that's kind of what we're trying to do to get the word out, to say that this is the #1 cause of homicide in our county.
You know, we have, as you well know, over 1 million people in this county. It's huge. And we have, how many, 36 beds, I think, dedicated to domestic violence in our shelters, and that's it. So, and the homicide, that's at the end. That's when there are no other choices. Before that, there's a multitude of times that people could get help and come to us so it doesn't escalate to that. We're really trying to get the word out.
Yeah.
That's good and right, and there's so many people involved in it, and we could talk a whole lot more about who they are and the different agencies and the nonprofits and everybody, but we're about out of time. I think it's just important to note that it's that public-private partnership. It's everybody's involvement, and the government is part of helping, but what we need is for people in the private sector and average citizens to step up and be aware, talk about it with friends and colleagues, and to maybe donate a bit to NOVACO and other organizations to help us out. And I'd like to thank Sandy Bromley and Kim Roman Corle for joining us and sharing what they are doing for the domestic violence victims in our county. With a growing number of reported crimes, it's important that we get out in front of this issue with our public. People like Sandy and Kim are addressing this critical issue. If you are a victim of domestic or sexual violence, or just want some information to help a friend in a situation, please call the 24-hour Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline at 703-360-7273. I hope you've enjoyed this segment of Braddock Neighborhood News. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, comments, or other needs, please contact my office at 703-425-9300. or email us at braddock@fairfaxcounty.gov. Tune in next month for another edition, and please remember to look for ways to volunteer. Your community needs you.